The sky over Europe in 1944 was no longer just a battlefield, but a hunting ground, not for territory, not for cities, but for men. Young men, flying at 20,000 feet, chasing survival in machines that moved faster than thought and failed faster than hope. Up there, above the clouds, there were no trenches, no cover, no second chances. Just speed, instinct, and the thin line between life and disappearance. By that stage of the war, the Allied bombing campaign had reached its peak. Massive formations of American bombers pushed deep into German territory every day, targeting factories, rail networks, oil depots, anything that kept the Nazi war machine alive. But those bombers were vulnerable. Slow, heavy, and predictable, they were easy prey for German fighters and anti-aircraft fire. So they needed protection, and that protection came in the form of fighter groups units, like the 55th Fighter Group of the United States Army Air Forces. The 55th had started its journey years earlier. Formed in California in 1940, before being sent across the Atlantic to England in 1943, where it joined the 8th Air Force. From bases carved into the English countryside, they launched mission after mission into enemy airspace. At first, they flew the P-38 Lightning, a twin-engine aircraft that could handle multiple roles: escort, reconnaissance, even bombing. But by mid-1944, they transitioned to something that would become legendary: the P-51 Mustang. The P-51 wasn't just another fighter. It was fast, agile, and capable of flying long distances, escorting bombers all the way into Germany and back. Armed with 6.50 caliber machine guns and capable of carrying bombs, it became one of the most important aircraft in the European air war. And the men who flew it quickly earned a reputation, not just as escorts, but as hunters. They called themselves the Loco Busters, because they didn't just protect bombers, they went looking for targets. Trains, oil tankers, locomotives, supply lines, anything that moved on rails became fair game. These missions were dangerous, flown low to the ground, where anti-aircraft fire was at its deadliest. The pilots even gave them a name that sounded almost casual: railroad rodeos. But there was nothing casual about them. At those altitudes, one mistake meant death. Losses were staggering. In 1944 alone, pilot casualties in the 55th Fighter Group were estimated at more than 50%. That meant if you joined the unit, there was a real chance you wouldn't survive long enough to become experienced. The sky didn't reward learning curves, it punished them. And yet, new pilots kept arriving. One of them stepped onto English soil in August 1944. He was tall over 6 feet, unusually tall for that. Iran carried himself with a quiet confidence. His name was James Ragsdale McCutcheon. He had come from a completely different world. Born in Fort Davis, Texas, he grew up on a ranch, surrounded by open land and wide skies. As a boy, he built model airplanes from balsa wood, launching them into the air and watching them glide, perhaps already imagining something bigger, faster, more real. It's often said that childhood dreams foreshadow the future. In his case, they did, but not in the way anyone would have hoped. Life had hardened him early. By the age of 16, he had lost both of his parents. Orphaned, he moved in with relatives and continued his education, eventually attending Texas A&M University. But the war was already shaping the world around him. Like many young men of his generation, he left college behind and enlisted. Training transformed him. He became a fighter pilot, trained to fly one of the most advanced aircraft of the war. By the time he arrived in England, he was no longer just a young man from Texas. He was a second lieutenant in the United States Army Air Forces, assigned to the 338th Fighter Squadron of the 55th Fighter Group. Among his fellow pilots, he earned a nickname, Big Stoop, a reference to his height. It was the kind of nickname pilots gave each other casually, a way to build camaraderie in a world where friendships often didn't last long. Because in that unit, time was measured differently. Not in months or years, but in missions survived. He arrived on August 3, 1944. 9 days later, he would be dead. That's how fast things moved in the skies over Europe. On the day of his final mission, the objective was clear. The 55th Fighter Group was tasked with attacking a marshalling yard near Ars. In France, a hub of rail traffic, carrying fuel and supplies for German forces. The mission was part of a larger strategy: destroy the enemy's ability to move, and you weaken everything else. Jim flew in formation, positioned on the wing of his flight leader, Captain Lenoy D. Anderson. The aircraft carried bombs 500-pound explosives, designed to tear through steel and fire. From 7,000 feet, they began their dive toward the target below. This was the most dangerous part of the mission. The moment when a pilot committed to the dive, there was no turning back. The ground rushed up fast. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Black bursts of flak filled the air. Timing had to be perfect, released too early, and the bombs missed. Too late, and you might not pull out in time. Anderson dropped his bombs and pulled up, banking sharply to escape. Behind him, Jim followed into the dive, and then he disappeared. No explosion was seen. No crash observed. Just a sudden absence. At first, there was confusion. In the chaos of combat, it wasn't unusual for pilots to lose sight of each other. Maybe he had continued the attack. Maybe he had gone lower, strafing targets on his own. Over the radio, his name was called once. Twice, no response. At that altitude, with radios crackling and multiple pilots talking at once, silence could mean anything. But as the formation regrouped and turned for home, it became clear. He wasn't coming back. Somewhere over occupied France, something had gone wrong. The official reports would later suggest that his aircraft had been hit by anti-aircraft fire and destroyed. The crash occurred near Revigny, east of the Ornain River. There was no dramatic last transmission, no final words recorded. Just a moment in the sky and then nothing. He was 20 years old, 9 days in combat, that was all. And yet, his story didn't end there. Because war doesn't just erase people, leaves traces, families, memories, questions that echo for decades. For years after his death, details of what happened remained unclear. Official documents weren't fully available. Records were incomplete. Like so many airmen lost in the war, his final moments existed only in fragments. But time has a way of bringing things back into the light. Decades later, his family continued searching. His great-nephew traveled to France, tracing the path of that final mission, walking the ground where Jim's aircraft had come down. For the people in that region, the memory had not disappeared. They remembered the crash. They remembered the young American pilot. In a land once occupied, liberation had come at a cost. They did not forget those who paid it. After the war, his remains were moved from a temporary burial site to a permanent resting place at the Epinal American Cemetery in France. There, among thousands of others, he was laid to rest, a name etched in stone, one of many who never came home. But numbers don't tell the story. They never do. Because behind every statistic, every missing, every killed in action, there is a life that was once ordinary. A boy who built model airplanes. A student who left college. A young man who stood on a runway in England, looking at a machine that could carry him into history. Or into oblivion. The 55th Fighter Group continued flying missions after his death. They escorted bombers deep into Germany, attacked railways, and fought enemy aircraft in the skies. They earned distinctions, destroyed hundreds of enemy targets, and helped turn the tide of the air war. But like all combat units, their success came at a cost, measured in empty seats and missing faces. The war would end in 1945. The skies over Europe would fall silent again. But stories like Jim McCutcheon's would remain quiet, almost forgotten, buried beneath larger narratives of victory and strategy. And yet, they matter just as much as the battles themselves. Because war is not just about nations, it is about individuals, moments, decisions, and sometimes it is about 9 days. 9 days between arrival and death. 9 days between hope and history. 9 days that began with a young pilot stepping onto foreign soil, and ended with his name carved into stone on that same continent. And somewhere, if you look at it the right way, that story says everything about the nature of war. Not the grand movements of armies or the shifting of borders, but the fragile, fleeting lives caught in between. Because in the end, the sky didn't belong to anyone. Not to the Germans, not to the Americans, not even to the men who flew through it. It belonged to chance. And on one day, in August 1944, chance took everything.